Okay, so we will go live now. Okay, so hello everyone. This is Kinzom from Australia Tibet Council. Welcome to our online talk series. Tonight we are having a conversation with Clive Hamilton, Australian public intellectual whose influential book in 2018, Silent Invasion, exposes the full extent of China's influence in Australian politics and community. So now, in an important follow-up to that book, Clive has just released his second book on China, Hidden Hand, which looks at the CCP's global program of influence and subversion and the threat that it is posing to our democracy. And more importantly, the book also looks at how our democracies should respond to the China threat. So on behalf of ATC and the Tibetan community, I want to thank you, Clive, for being such an important voice in the China debate in Australia. And I am also very delighted that tonight's conversation with Clive will be moderated by a young Tibetan, Sawang Thupten.
Young, thank you, Aja.
Of the Tibetan community and an avid observer of Australian politics. So welcome to you both, and I now would like to hand over to you, Sawang.
Thanks, Aja, and thank you to the Australia Tibet Council for hosting this discussion, and of course, thank you to Professor Hamilton for agreeing to participate tonight. Look, it's actually a bit of a personal be participating as a ANU alumni. It's I think a lot of us have taken a lot of pride in watching Professor Hamilton over the years, all the way back to your book with Dr. Dennis. I'm a big fan of this book, and I'm sure there's a lot of people in the Tibet world who would really enjoy reading this. I highly recommend Affluenza, which as a Tibetan and a Buddhist really resonated with me. And so if we could just begin tonight's conversation actually on a slightly personal note, going from your work as someone speaking about sort of the myth of endless economic growth to climate change, and now ending up talking about the undermining of our democracy, can I ask, what would you say, Professor Hamilton, were the major influences in your upbringing, or the sort of major moments in your life that propelled you academically to make such a great contribution to Australian public discourse? What was it that sort of led you here?
Yeah, that's a question from left field, but that's fine. Thank you for asking it. Yeah, that's a good question. I guess I was brought up in a way where, in a family where values and compassion were important, and I guess that kind of sank in. But I also, I suppose, from an early age, from where I don't know, I had a kind of fire in the belly, and that led me to be, a young protester during the 1970s in those social movements, and I found myself at a lot of demonstrations as a high school student, and then when I was a student at the Australian National University. There was a lot going on there. There was the anti-apartheid movement. There was the tent embassy. I was there on the first day when we linked arms around it and defended it from the police who were trying to tear it down. Of course, a lot of anti-Vietnam protests. So yeah, it was very much something I was just kind of driven to do, and then after ANU, I went to the University of Sydney to do a second degree in economics or political economy, and I became heavily involved in quite a radical student movement there for more political economy to be taught, but also a kind of radical critique of consumer capitalism and the power of multinationals. That was very much the kind of political milieu in which I developed. And then I kind of went quiet while I did a PhD, and then I got my first job back at the Australian National University, as it happens, when I came back from the United Kingdom. And I was teaching in the graduate program of the Economics of Development, where, among other things, I recruited quite a number of Chinese students to enroll in the ANU. And then after a few years of being an academic and a public servant and other things, I became really deeply dissatisfied and just kind of left to set up a progressive think tank, the Australia Institute, in the early 1990s. And kind of the rest is history. A lot of the early work at the Institute was countering neoliberalism, privatisation and so on. And then we moved more and more into analysing consumerism and its and people remember this was in a kind of big economic and consumer boom in the late 90s and early 2000s, and there was a lot going on, a lot of social questioning about, well, we've got the big house and the swimming pool and so on, but is this what life is all about? And that kind of resonated with me from my own personal experiences. So I started to do a lot of work on that, which led to that book with Richard Dennis on Affluenza, which came out before the global financial crisis in 2008. It came out in 2005 and was a big hit because it resonated with a lot of people really questioning, the meaning of life. Is affluence all there is to it? And a lot of people were looking for an alternative, such as downshifting, cutting their income and adopting a simpler lifestyle. And so it really resonated with those people too.
I think any book which has a chapter that starts with reminiscing about the ABC TV show Sea Change is always going to be a bit of a hit, Professor. Definitely with me and my parents anyway. And then you obviously made a pretty big contribution with the Australian Institute in discussions about climate change and economic reform. And then that migrated to today, where you're one of the leading voices on how the CCP is trying to undermine our democratic institutions and the integrity of our academic institutions. How did you progress from the climate change issue to the one that we're tackling today? Was there an obvious or common sort of thread? Because as a Tibetan, we are sort of at this nexus point where we are obviously dealing with Chinese influence to a slightly greater degree, and are also defined by many as being the roof of the world and dealing with this climate change catastrophe. Was there an obvious pathway for you from climate change to this issue, or was it a range of other issues that brought you here?
No, there was no natural path. I kind of kept a watch on China as a kind of amateur for many years. At university, I'd taken a course in the Chinese Revolution. I was interested in the history, but really hadn't paid too much attention. Although, as a climate change author, of course, in the 2010s, China became increasingly important to the climate change debate. And in fact, like many others in the climate movement, let's say, I pinned a lot of hopes on China that it could kind of break through and help us solve the dilemma. It didn't turn out that way. But, I'd written 4 books on climate change, increasingly despairing books on climate change. And I'd written a book which actually came out in 2017 called Defiant Earth, The Fate of Humans in the Anthropocene, this new geological epoch that we're entering into, which is a more kind of philosophical reflection on where humans have ended up after this disastrous failure to respond to this really, I don't use the word lightly, this existential threat to humankind. And I take your point about Tibet and the melting of glaciers and all kinds of climatic transformations affecting people there. But no, it was really after I'd sent the Defiant Earth off to the publisher, I was kind of at a loose end, and there were a bunch of news stories that emerged about Sam Dastyari and his involvement with this Chinese businessman, Huang Jiangmo, and Huang's links to the Chinese Communist Party and his role as an agent of influence for Beijing in Australia. Huang, as you know, is now banned from re-entering the country because of his links to the Communist Party. And I'd run out of things to say about climate change. I was exhausted by it. And then these stories popped up, and I thought, you know what? Here we have a situation where the major donors to our political parties, both of the big ones, are Chinese or Chinese Australian business people. What is going on? This is bizarre. And the more I looked into it, the more I realised that this is a massive issue for Australia's democracy. And I thought, that's my next book. And when I ran a think tank for many years, my role was to really try to pick the zeitgeist. And so that stuff on consumerism that you mentioned, we were really at the head of the curve there. We were picking up what Australians were going to be worried about in 12 or 24 months' time. And that's why we could have such a big impact, the ability to kind of pick what's going to be the next big thing. And it just seemed to me, when these stories started to appear, that CCP influence in Australia was the next big thing. So I decided to write a book, and I went and spoke to a bunch of experts and said, is anybody else doing this book? Because, hey, I'm not an expert. And they said, no, but you should do it, Clive, because they knew my reputation as someone who could write for the public, basically. And so as I researched it, that book, Silent Invasion, I realised just how big and sinister this problem of the growth and influence of the CCP is in Australia and around the world. And so I became quickly drawn into this kind of massive geopolitical issue. I had no idea really at the start just quite what I was getting myself into. But here I am. And after Silent Invasion came out, which, as you know, was enormously controversial and brought all kinds of fire down upon me, it was actually suggested by my publisher that I should do a silent invasion for the rest of the world. That's where the idea came from. And I realised I couldn't do it by myself because I didn't have the expertise. And so I asked Mareike Olberg, a well-known German sinologist, if she would like to co-author it. And here we are today.
And I think at the time that Silent Invasion came out, there was obviously a lot of pressure placed on the publisher. There was a lot of pressure placed on yourself. But not long afterwards, we had the foreign interference legislation come through, and a really sort of well-drafted response almost to some of the key issues that you raised in your book. I think in many people's minds, the current status of our relationship with China seems to have come out of the blue, but for people like Kinjumla and people like yourself who have been watching for a while, this has been something that's been going on for a while. So what we're seeing now is a more overt, more direct, sort of coercive effort by China to bully Australia into the most obvious demand of the Chinese is to not make such a noise about the investigation into the coronavirus. But how have we come to this point so drastically? So, I mean, when your book first came out, there was sort of the margins of business or politics or education where there's discussions about Chinese influence. Now it's a mainstream concern, and if you look at the polling for most Australians, it's one of the key sort of political concerns. And when it comes to trust in the Chinese government, it's at all-time lows, distrust is at all-time highs. How do you think it's so rapidly changed from the time that your book was launched and there was an idea that we need to essentially address China's sort of dodgy statecraft or dodgy sort of soft power use, and to the point now where it seems almost like we are at a point of complete opposition to China?
Well, it's interesting to watch in the last weeks how silent the pro-Beijing forces are in Australia. Many of the ones that I named in silent invasion as essentially CCP apologists have really gone quiet because it's very, very hard to speak up for China or even call for the usual kind of talk about we need a more balanced and nuanced approach. Whenever anyone uses the word we need a nuanced approach, I think, because we don't need a nuanced approach because the lines are really clear. I mean, you don't need to be a brilliant sinologist or a person who spent 8 years teaching in Beijing or whatever to understand what's happening here. It's pretty clear. So what happened when silent invasion came out? Two things were really important. Well, lots of things were important, but two things should have told people immediately that something big is going on. One, the publisher, my established publisher that published some 8 of my previous books, pulled out at the last moment because they were scared. They were scared of retaliation from Beijing. Now, this was a massive thing. I mean, no publisher in Australia had ever behaved that way, intimidated out of publishing a book by a foreign power. Never. I mean, Britain had attempted to suppress 1 or 2 books through the courts. No publishers took that on with relish. Great, let's do it. We'll fight them in the courts.
Free marketing.
Yeah, exactly. No publisher had ever said, you know what, we're scared of this big foreign government, so we're just not going to publish a book critical of it. It was, and I was attacked frequently for all kinds of reasons. Mostly by people who had a strong element of anti-Americanism, which I've always had, incidentally. But the evidence of CCP influence and oppression is trumps that, if I can put it in those terms. But the other thing so that was a really, really remarkable event. No wonder it was a front page news around the world. So that must send a very powerful signal because Allen & Unwin is a very respectable company that doesn't do that kind of thing. And then no other publisher in Australia would go near my book. I expected them to all come knocking on my door because already it had bestseller written all over it. If you can't get it published, it's going to be a bestseller almost certainly. But they didn't come rushing. I didn't have a publisher for a couple of months. And it was only when Hardy Grant said, no, you know what? We do business and make a profit so we can pay our staff, but we also believe in free speech, so we're going to take a risk.
Yeah, good on them.
Yeah. So that's one thing that happened. The other thing that happened was within weeks, I mean, it was a bestseller, and it was ordinary Australians, if I can use that term, not sinologists or journalists or, bureaucrats or politicians buying the book. It was everyday Australians who bought it in large numbers, and I got constant stream of emails from people all over Australia in all kinds of different circumstances saying, we're so glad that you wrote your book because it explained to us what is going on. We were worried and they'd mentioned something that had bothered them, whether it was Sam Dastyari or some purchase of an electricity network or some strategic asset or something like that had bothered them. And then suddenly my book came along and explained it in a way they could understand. So the Australian public was awake to something going on, and the book took off. but also the government laws. And let's give credit to the Turnbull government, because that legislation you mentioned, that was in train when my book came out. It was already being discussed and drafted when my book came out. And I think what my book helped to do was to explain to the Australian public why that legislation was necessary, because otherwise many people thought, well, why are you doing this? And if you saw the submissions that were made to the parliamentary inquiry by the Intelligence Committee into the legislation before it was introduced to Parliament, there were so many groups saying, well, we don't see why you need to do this. This is just eroding Australians' rights. And there was no understanding that actually Australians' rights were already being undermined by an authoritarian power. Just go and speak to the Tibetans for the Chinese Australians who want to speak up in favour of democracy and against the CCP. Their rights are being severely eroded. And this legislation has been put in place to defend their rights. So get real here. We're facing a major threat. But, I've known from decades in public life that it takes quite a while for a nation to shift its understanding of something as big and important as the place of China in Australia's future.
I think that's an interesting dilemma that we're facing right now is this issue, obviously it traverses a range of major themes, from economics to culture to education to our sort of view of ourselves in the world. We've had lots of sort of differing, we've had Hugh White questioning our sort of our long-held dedication to the American alliance. We've had different sort of voices sort of articulating over the last, I guess, decade, a range of different positions that Australia can take when it comes to dealing with the rise of China. And we're kind of now seeing ourselves forced by China's behaviour to almost a defensive posture, I guess, in many ways now, Australia in the last few weeks. But just that's, I guess, speaking about how our government has to respond. But as citizens, as academics, as activists, we're finding ourselves in this very unusual sort of crossroads or meeting point between a lot of different issues as well, where we're, as people who want to discuss these issues, we're met by some arguments about the issue which can seem contradictory. So as someone that might advocate for the Tibet issue, you might hear people defend this issue from with a defense of that it's racist to broach this topic in the manner that it has been. Have you been finding that as you're trying to discuss this issue in a sort of a practical, pragmatic view with real sort of case study based issues, you're finding that there's a lot of this discussion which is being overrun by broader themes about racism and marginalization, that this other discourse is sometimes making it quite difficult to break through on this issue?
Definitely with some groups. There's no doubt about that. I mean, progressive Australians, for good historical reasons, are extremely sensitive about racism and anything that might provoke the racist element in Australian society. And I don't, it's across Australian society. I don't want to just say, well, there's this 2% of the population that are horribly racist. I mean, racism is quite an entrenched element of Australian society, as we've seen in certain very prominent cases. I'm thinking about the Adam Goodes affair, for example. I think it's despicable what happened to Adam Goodes. So there's this kind of hair trigger in parts of the progressive left. And I've kind of been part of it. I've been participating in opposing racism for a long time. and have intervened at various points in various ways, from writing opinion pieces and commissioning research. For example, at the Australian Institute, one of the first major pieces of research that we did was to do a careful analysis of the claim by Pauline Hanson that Aboriginal people got a very too generous to wealth. And we thought it's a powerful argument that was out there and influential. And we thought, well, let's look at the figures. And so we did. And it was actually quite hard to do the analysis. But the end result was, well, actually, Indigenous Australians don't get special treatment. And you could argue that they should, but the reality is they don't. So it's always something that we Australians need to be sensitive about. And that's why, I made sure when I started to research silent invasion that that was kind of the end of 2016 and through 2017, that I sought out the views of Chinese Australians and Chinese people. And that was an extremely interesting exercise. I learned a lot in that exercise. And one of the things I said to someone, Chinese Australian person who'd helped me a lot in the book, I said to him, as I was finishing the book, I said, now when this book comes out, even though I have tried to distinguish meticulously between the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese people, and make it clear that the target here is the Chinese Communist Party, and that people of Chinese heritage are frequently, in fact, consistently the biggest victims of the Chinese Communist Party. Nevertheless, by writing this book, there will be elements within Australia that exploit it to enhance racist arguments, xenophobia. And I said to him, well, that's a dilemma, isn't it? And he said, well, yeah, it might have that impact, but what's the alternative? Do we just shut up about the Chinese Communist Party? Do we not expose what it's up to? And he said to me, I remember this very distinctly, he said, I'm more scared of the Chinese Communist Party than I am of an element of racism in Australia. And so, but nevertheless, when the book came out, they all piled on, all the people for all kinds of reasons, some in bad faith, painting and trolls and Wu Mao who were mobilising the racist argument as a political weapon, and some people, even within the Greens, I'm a member of the Greens, and that caused great ructions in the New South Wales Greens, although the Tasmanian Greens were completely on board. But there were people within the New South Wales Greens who were saying, oh, this is an attack on Chinese people and we mustn't have anything to do with it. And so they were willing to overlook all of the oppression and the dark money and the foreign interference and the South China Sea because, there are a couple of Chinese Australian members of the party, or in one case not a member of the party, who was kicking up a fuss and saying this is all racist. So that was a big problem in the sense that there were a whole bunch of progressive people in Australia who should have been right onto this. We're talking about an extremely authoritarian power engaged in the most vile human rights abuse against all kinds of minority peoples. And here you have a bunch of progressive people who we don't want to know about. We're more worried about some people in Australia who are afraid of, with good cause, of xenophobia here. And instead of trying to balance that and manage it, they said, no, all of these criticisms of the Chinese Communist Party are just racist, and therefore we're going to ignore it and we're going to attack and discredit Clive Hamilton. Now, I actually found that difficult. And I could not help but think of how some parties acted in the 1930s with the rise of a militarizing, authoritarian, expansionist power built around a cult of personality. And, you know, the similarities, I don't make them lightly. I think they are serious similarities. And there are all kinds of apologists in the 1930s who wanted to overlook the risks, the dangers, the terror, even right up to 1939-40. People in Britain were apologising or saying it's not that bad. Stop catastrophizing.
But Professor Hamilton, you do talk about the Greens there as being that way in response to your initial book, but given the recent piece of legislation that the Independents and the Greens tried to pass that didn't get up about wanting a more thorough examination, a legislated examination of our relationship with China, you'd say that they've definitely changed policy, at least on a federal level, in regards to that issue. So we're now obviously we've kind of moved into this new epoch in a way. So we had this period where obviously up until almost, you'd say, the start of the coronavirus, or maybe some people might like to mark it at the beginning of the Trump administration, where there was essentially corporate America was dictating the global approach to dealing with the Communist Party, where Wall Street profits were the primary driver of international foreign policy. And now we're at a point where China has either on their own of their own volition made some sort of dramatic change. Some people are putting it down to internal power issues between Xi Jinping and his leadership struggles, trying to divert attention externally as the problems mount internally. We've got them coming into conflict with India on their border. Overnight, 20 Indian soldiers have been reported as dying, and they're becoming more assertive with their neighbours in the South China Sea. Would you say that China's recent, very clear economic signals to Australia with advice to tourists and students about Australia being a racist destination, somewhat unsafe, about the approach with barley and a few of our abattoir exporters, would you say this is indicating that China might be changing from trying to be more subtle in its efforts? And if so, why are they changing tack now? Is it reflective of something?
Yes. Well, I mean, the first half, I think, is easy to answer. In my view, Beijing has shifted a gear in recent weeks, very, very markedly. I mean, we have this extraordinary situation where when Maurice Payne said we want an independent international inquiry, Beijing made all kinds of threats, which you kind of expected to do, but Australia didn't back down, and soon the community made the decision and an inquiry is going ahead. And yet, and this is the significant thing, Beijing has decided on a campaign of punishment. I don't think it's finished with barley and beef and tourism and education, and possibly the misuse of the court system in Beijing to punish an Australian. And so it does represent something new, definitely. And as you're suggesting, Beijing seems to be picking fights all over the world. Probably picked the fight on the Indian border. I mean, it's hard to see why the India would pick a fight. It's picked a fight with Sweden. It's picking fights in the South China Sea. I noticed Malaysia and even the Philippines and Egypt are starting to push back, not meant to be that. And they're now making threats in the United Kingdom because it looks like they're carefully cultivated elite support. And so Beijing, I think, has been spooked by the coronavirus, which has caused a massive hit to its reputation around the world and really derailed many of its plans for global influence and discourse control. And so instead of stepping back and recalibrating, this is the interesting thing, something's happened within the party, as you're suggesting, where they've decided, you know what, we're just going to muscle up. And so we've got wolf warrior diplomacy, you've got a program of punishing Australia materially for what seemed to be an innocuous call for an inquiry. And so it seems to have taken the view that this is the only explanation I can think of, that they've said, look, all kinds of people are creating trouble for us. We think we're powerful enough now to take them on, to let the mask drop, and to assert our superior power. So maybe that reflects internal dynamics, and Xi Jinping has decided that he needs the iron-fisted ruler abroad as well as at home. It will be interesting to see how things unfold over the next month.
A question from Facebook, which I think it's a good time to ask it now, is Australia bold enough to challenge China's bullying, or will Australia? I'll just paraphrase this. Or is Australia going to kowtow to China during this pandemic? What do you think of Australia's approach?
Well, I mean, it's a good question, because I think that Beijing has shifted its approach in recent weeks, but so has Australia, and I think other nations will too. Thinking of the United Kingdom in particular, and possibly even Canada. I mean, Canada's kind of a mess politically, but we'll get to that if we wanted to. But it's been very interesting, and I have to say reassuring, that in response to this really quite unprecedented campaign to punish Australia, with the only objective not being some change of policy here or there, the only objective seems to be to bully us into submission. I mean, I think the only thing that will satisfy Beijing is if we back down completely.
Which is pretty ham-fisted diplomacy, isn't it? By most sort of...
Well, it's worked in the past. I mean, Beijing has been pretty successful with us for the last couple of years. If Beijing made a complaint and made a veiled threat, then the likelihood was that Australia would back down and make some sign of, of submission. But now the Morrison government has decided, no, we're going to stay firm on it, because there are fundamental values at stake, and therefore we're not going to buckle to this pressure. And so they calmly and firmly are sticking to their position. And in fact, the Foreign Minister's speech last night was a particularly firm statement of Australia's position. Now, that's important because the Morrison government has now locked itself in. It can't back down now. It would be the greatest grovel in the history of Australia's diplomatic history if, after taking this strong stance, the Morrison government decided to give way and grovel. So the Australian government has decided that on behalf of Australia, that it will take the pain. And I think a factor in that is that there has been such a shift in public sentiment in Australia over the last 2 years, as you alluded to in your opening comments, that from a pure political calculus, the Morrison government can't back down without severe political damage to itself.
If we sort of look ahead, do you think Australia is going to be on its own in this wave? Like you've already sort of mentioned Canada as sort of maybe too far gone, being too late in its response to the United Front's work in Canada and other sort of economic sort of dependencies that China's created. Is Australia going to have, besides from obviously the United States, is Australia somehow going to find itself with like-minded nations in the way that it's dealing with China?
I think that's pretty clear that a string of nations around the world are deciding that a firmer stance is necessary against China's bullying and expansionism. and I'm thinking of Japan. There's growing anxiety amongst the Japanese public about CCP influence. As it happens, Silent Invasion was published in Japan 3 weeks ago, and completely unexpectedly, it's been a massive bestseller. I mean, who would have thought it? Here's a book completely about Australia, translated and sold into Japan, and it's flying off the bookshelves. I mean, really in an extraordinary way. You know, we can hardly believe the figures coming from the publisher. And I think in Southeast Asia, as I mentioned, there are more nations pushing back. And I think wolf warrior diplomacy in Europe has it's not been a complete failure, but it has caused a backlash in certain key countries like France and the United Kingdom. I think, you know, Marika Olberg and I are really quite pessimistic about the United Kingdom as we wrote the book and finished it off. There has been quite a shift in UK politics in the last month or two, galvanised around Huawei. Now, the big question here is the presidential election in November in the United States. This is absolutely fundamental and vital because Trump has had this kind of paradoxical position that he decided, after a lot of pushing, it should be said, to resist China and inaugurate the trade war. You know, he was trying to be nice to Xi Jinping for a long time. He thought he'd get his way by being nice. And, you know, because he believes he's a better deal maker. I mean, talk about, but the mood has shifted so much in the United States, and by that I mean particularly in policy and think tank and Congress, that the Democrats are just as strongly determined to stand up to the PRC as the Republicans are. The difference is that if Joe Biden wins, and I'm not saying there aren't certain problems with Joe Biden, but if Joe Biden wins, he will prosecute a China policy not that different to Trump's, but he will do it in a far more strategic, carefully thought through and effective way. And he'll surround himself with people who aren't yes men, but who give him sensible advice about the best way to do it. The most important thing of all is that Trump's paradox was he decided to stand up to China, but to alienate all of his allies. Now, this played perfectly into Beijing's hands. And as a result of it, Europe is nearly lost. I mean, Germany is still wavering. Germany still wants to be Xi Jinping's best friend. Hard to see how that might go, but the UK is lost. France is now really starting to think, why are we engaging? A crucial country like Sweden is completely alienated. And so if Biden wins the presidency and then institutes pushback against Beijing, but does it in a coordinated way with the Western allies, then Beijing really is in trouble, big trouble. That's why I'm convinced that Beijing wants Trump to win. They're worried about a Biden.
I guess for a lot of progressives, it's been a difficult time if Tibet has been something which you've really cared about, because you know these populist leaders, whether it's Boris Johnson or Donald Trump, they've taken more decisive action to confront China on these issues, sometimes weaponizing issues like Hong Kong or Taiwan simply to better their own trade position, negotiating position on trade or other issues. But in many ways, Trump, I think a lot of observers think that Bannon was quite influential in his shaping of his approach to China, and he's a firm believer in the notion of the Thucydides trap, and that eventually China will rise and pose an existential crisis to American hegemony. But for those of us that are not so comfortable with that nihilistic forecast and want to see some other way forward, Tibetans have for the past 60 years under the leadership of the Dalai Lama espoused a sort of middle path approach with China. As a country occupied militarily by the Chinese and having 1 million people having died under Chinese occupation, we've still extended to the Chinese this olive branch of discourse, wanting to engage with China and find a political solution which meets the interests of the Communist Party, whilst ensuring the integrity of the or survival of the Tibetan people as a unique culture and language and religion. Do you think it's possible that the world can find some sort of middle ground with the Communist Party, or is there something intrinsic about that government that makes it impossible for Western democracies to continue with the previous sort of Clinton era relic that simple trade and interaction will somehow resolve all these issues? Is there some way that we can work with the Communist Party? Do you imagine that there's some middle ground we could find with them?
I think certainly the Chinese Communist Party in its current manifestation, that's not going to be possible. The question is whether the Communist Party itself can be transformed in a way that makes it open to that way of thinking about the world. I actually think that the Chinese Communist Party under Xi Jinping more purely and more authentically the Leninist party that it always claimed to be. I don't think it strayed from its historical path, but I think in a way it fulfilled its historical destiny. It's a catastrophic destiny for the rest of the world. Right? And one of the things, of course, that Xi Jinping did was to purge the liberal element within the party, which the West had placed its faith in. Now, we believed that China, even under the CCP, could be drawn into the global community as a responsible player, and that its oppressive tendencies could be countered by its international obligations, and a more liberal society would develop, even if it remained under the rule of the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, I don't think anyone believes that anymore. It's very hard to see tendencies within the party that could lead to the overthrow of the hawks that are currently dominant. So systematic has been Xi Jinping's purge of the party. Clearly, though, and this is very interesting, that Xi Jinping has many enemies in the party, of course, and some very strong critics, some of whom have punishingly spoken out. The level of criticism that's been levelled at Xi Jinping by a handful of brave souls has been so harsh and so sharp, it's kind of shocked me. Full of admiration for them, but of course they've all disappeared, and their fate is probably not very promising. All hail to them and their courage. So it's hard to see the party transforming itself. But, one thing I learned as a student of history, not least in writing that book you mentioned on the story of protest in Australia, and that is that history can change suddenly and unpredictably. And Chinese history has illustrated that, the Tiananmen Square massacre, for instance. So I wouldn't want to be too doctrinaire about this, but it's hard to see trends leading to softer, kinder Chinese Communist Party.
Hello.
Hello, I'm here.
Clive, sorry, it seems our moderator Zawang dropped out. So let me jump in, and I have been following the comments on Facebook, and one question that I might pose while we wait for Zawang to jump back in is the comment from Kerry Wright saying, racism is rife in China as we saw during COVID. Why is the CCP so attached to deflecting by projection and punishment? Is it just that they know our weak points, including our social and political divisions, unresolved historical issues, sensational media, polarized wealth, and a national taste for drama, not resolution? Or are they getting desperate with their Monty Pythonesque global threats? Okay, so Sawang, I will go back into the background once again.
Oh, sorry, that was my my internet connection. Apologies.
That's okay.
Okay, well, that's a really fascinating question. And, you know, I think the CCP had an opportunity to really make some kind of breakthrough in January of this year. When the novel coronavirus broke out, the party could have responded in a way that, you know, any sensible government would do, and that is suddenly this SARS-like flu has broken out. Doctors are very worried. I'm thinking now back to the 30th and 31st of December. Scientists are desperately trying to work out what it is. Chinese scientists and pathology labs very, very quickly determined that this was a new virus, very worrying. But instead of openly gathering the information and allowing the citizens of Wuhan to know what was going on, they, in their usual paranoid fashion, decided to shut everything down, discipline the doctors, close down labs, instruct scientists they're not allowed to publish anything or speak to any journalists, arrest citizen journalists, regulate social media, and they just shut the whole thing down. And this was catastrophic for China and for the rest of the world because it delayed a proper response to it. But it told us something very important about the party under Xi Jinping, and that was that they're paranoid. And they're paranoid about not controlling information and not being able to control a situation suddenly erupted in Wuhan. They didn't know what to do, they didn't control it, they didn't understand it, so they shut it down. And then when some senior official did a first tour through some of the apartment compounds in Wuhan as a kind of inspection, something very interesting happened. The residents came to their balconies and they started shouting abuse at this Communist Party official, saying, fake, you know, get out of here. And so that made the Beijing and the party bosses very, very nervous. And so they had a meeting in early February and they said, you know what, we need a massive propaganda campaign. We need to take control of the debate in China and globally because this is a threat to it. And I think that was a profound mistake, try and shut down information. You know, I don't believe it's true that information wants to be free as a general rule, but in this case it definitely did. And it was already out there. And so much is now known that the CCP can't shut it down, and its attempts to reframe the global narrative as a great victory for the Communist Party and socialism with Chinese characteristics is, frankly, laughable. And people are laughing at the Chinese Communist Party in its attempt to rewrite history. And so I think that told us that it's very hard to imagine that the Chinese Communist Party, certainly in its current iteration, can be any kind of responsible player and can be approached in a reasonable way to discuss sensible ways forward.
I think
Very interesting question. I mean, quite clear that from a purely political point of view, there's going to be a growing expectation on our government that it ought to defend its basic rights. I mean, if they're going to draw a line in the sand in Australia and say these are our values and these are our democratic institutions, and sorry, we're not going to allow you to interfere with them because they're fundamental to us, it will probably increase the pressure on Australian governments to speak out in a careful way and certainly not a shrill way about the rights of people being oppressed by Beijing. And you know, the Uyghurs come to mind in one of the great crimes of the 21st century, what's been done in Xinjiang. So I think that the Australian government will begin, in fact, the Foreign Minister flagged this last night. The Australian government will begin to form alliances, to reform and strengthen alliances of democratic nations in our region and beyond, to start taking a clearer and firmer stance on global human rights, not just violations of them in China, but wherever they may occur, because we have really gone soft. Once again, Donald Trump is not a help here. I mean, we know that Donald Trump doesn't understand or care about human rights. Trump is a proto-dictator. He had the opportunity, if the institutions in the US allowed it, there's every possibility that he would adopt dictatorial powers. We saw how he wanted to use the military during the Black Lives Matter protest. So that really does matter a lot, whether the United States returns to its traditional, if somewhat conflicted position as the defender of human rights around the world. Yes, I know the United States has a lot to apologise for, and its record is extremely blemished. But the truth is that we're not just talking about US governments, but the whole of US civil society, its NGOs, its media, its activists, extraordinary commitment to human rights, defence of whatever its federal government might be doing. So, let's hope that a US gets a federal government that is in harmony with those NGOs, those civil rights lawyers, the progressive media that defends human rights, and so that the US will become a force for good in alliance with other democratic nations around the world.
I think that's been a concern for a lot of Tibetans and Uyghur people, is the even though that America may have recently been more vocal and more strident in protecting its own interests with relation to China, it's deeply damaged its credibility with the Chinese people and the credibility of the idea of democracy, which is a constant sort of theme of the Communist Party's rhetoric, both internally and externally, that the Chinese people are not suited to democracy and the Communist Party is the most appropriate form of government. And I guess that's why it's so important to have discussions like this and have books like yours, which obviously are a shining light of the true nature of our democracy, which is about civil discourse and citizens standing up and taking responsibility for what's going on in their countries and being permitted to do so, and even under the as you said, with your publisher being under threat of coercion and economic pressure, you were able to find another publisher. You were able to find allies in our parliament, and so it's obviously very strange times we live in, and in many ways, as progressive people or people that care about human rights, it can seem quite discombobulating, if I could use that word. But I think your book that you've just released is available now. And can you speak a little bit about how this book is addressing this issue and what it hopes to contribute to this really important discussion?
Yeah, all right. Well, just to finish off, I mean, really, the whole kind of strategy behind writing this book and the previous one is based on the fact that the Chinese Communist Party likes to operate in the shadows, covert, secretive activities. I mean, yes, it's blatant and out there and wolf warrior and so on at the moment, and will continue to be so, but we mustn't forget this kind of huge campaign, highly successful, of insinuating itself into the institutions of democracy, gaining friends amongst elites and so on, which has been really essential to protecting and projecting Beijing's power. So the strategy of this book is to shed light, is to explain what the CCP does so that people can understand, and when they see it in their communities or their workplaces or their institutions or their politics, they'll recognise and understand what's happening. And so that's why Marika and I wrote this book. Australians have a pretty sophisticated understanding now after the debate and so on over the last 2 or 3 years. But other countries are way behind Australia. And so we hope that this book will contribute to the public discussion and the shedding of light on what the CCP is up to in their country.
Thank you, Professor Hamilton. Your work is so important, timely, and hopefully will inform and influence public discourse and our policymakers. I encourage everyone to read Professor Hamilton's latest book, The Hidden Hand. And I think it's important because if we can better understand these issues, it makes us better citizens, it makes us better voters. So thank you again, Professor Hamilton, for speaking to us tonight. And I also want to thank our hosts, the Austrailia Tibet Council, who, without their efforts to organise this and inviting Professor Hamilton and myself, this wouldn't have been possible. Ajahn Kinjunla, would you like to make any closing remarks? Have we lost Ajahn Kinjunla?
No.
Oh.
Yeah. So yes, thank you for this fascinating discussion. I think yes, we have gone away with some very important insights into how the CCP functions in Australia. And as all of us know, Australia has been this kind of ground zero for Chinese influence. And because we have faced this, sooner than many other countries, and because of that, we have, taken some measures. I think the whole world can look at Australia, learn some important lessons. And the world can learn lessons not only from Australia, but also from Tibet. Australia has been the laboratory of Chinese influence. Likewise, Tibet has been this laboratory of Chinese repressive policies. So I think for the international community to really understand China, they have to look at Tibet. They have, and in more recent times, they have to look at Australia. And as I think we touched on very important points about how the progressive left, have somehow, left Tibetans, many Tibetans, progressive like myself, quite disheartened by the whole China debate in this country, which unfortunately has really played into Chinese hands. And so I think we just need, more clarity and more courage here in this country. Australia's relationship with China has always, been handled through this, lens of either greed or fear. And now, this pandemic, this global crisis, as every crisis does, it is an opportunity to build something better, to create something new. And we hope that, this crisis will be an opportunity for us to reimagine a whole new relationship with China, a relationship that is not good, not only for Australia, but also for Tibet. So on that note, I want to thank you, Clive. You are a rare voice of courage and clarity, and for Tsawang for your excellent moderation and discussion. And I would like to, and actually next week, ATC, Australia Tibet Council, we are doing our online Tibet Lobby Week. We'll be carrying many of these messages to our politicians, to the meetings. So thank you for that. And for those of you watching us live, if you're not on the Australia Tibet Council mailing list, please consider joining us and taking part in our campaigns.
Thank you very much. I really appreciated the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you, Thomas. And thank you, Tsawang. So, and thank you for your questions and comments.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Ajahn. Bye.